The king of the city was supposed to take his final breath in that alleyway. Dante Moretti, left bleeding against a cold brick wall. His custom-tailored suit shredded and soaked in the city's rain. It wasn't the rival families who finally got to him. It wasn't a police raid. It was his own brothers, the men who sat at his table, the ones who toasted to his health just an hour before the lights went out. Hours felt like days. The neon signs of the nightclub flickered above, mocking his descent. His vision began to cloud. Then he heard them, footsteps. Not the heavy thud of tactical boots. Not the click of a safety being disengaged. A woman stood there, her silhouette framed by a warm, vintage lantern. She should have turned away. In this part of the city, you don't stop for a dying man in a ruined suit. Instead, she knelt in the grime. She pressed a soft scarf against the jagged wound on his temple and whispered words Dante hadn't heard in a lifetime. "I've got you. You're not alone." He didn't know her name. Amara Vance didn't know he was the most feared name in the state. But as the urban rain washed away the blood of his old life, Dante realized something that terrified him more than death. For the first time, someone was saving him. Not for power, not for a payout, but because she chose to. Stay with me until the end. Because the blood spilled in that alley would force Dante to choose between the throne he lost and the woman who gave him a reason to stay. The gray morning light filtered through a modest window as Dante Moretti opened his eyes to a ceiling he didn't recognize. The scent of lavender and fresh brewed coffee filled his lungs instead of the usual expensive cigars and Italian leather of his penthouse. His body screamed in 1,000 places he'd forgotten existed, every breath a sharp reminder of Julian's knife in his ribs. A soft humming drifted from a small kitchen, accompanied by the gentle clink of a ceramic mug. Dante tried to sit up, his hand instinctively reaching for the beretta that always rested under his pillow. His fingers found only soft cotton sheets. The sudden movement sent a flare of white-hot pain through his side, and he hissed a curse that would have made his enforcers tremble. The humming stopped. Light, careful footsteps approached. Amara appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming cup and wearing a look of genuine concern, the kind of look Dante hadn't seen since before he took the crown. Her dark hair was pulled back, and she wore a simple wool sweater that spoke of a world where a man's value wasn't measured in the sharpness of his suit. The weight of Dante Moretti was a physical manifestation of a dying empire. As Amara Vance guided him through the narrow, dim hallway of her apartment building, his shoulder leaned heavily against hers, the ruined silk of his jacket damp with the city's grime. Each of his staggered breaths was a ragged, wet sound that echoed against the peeling wallpaper, a stark contrast to the distant rhythmic thumping of the bass still vibrating from the nightclub 3 blocks away. She had managed to get him past the sleepy eyes of the night doorman by draping her own dark wool overcoat over his blood-stained shoulders, hiding the jagged tears in his white dress shirt. To the world, they were just another couple stumbling home after a long night in the neon-soaked districts of the city. No one would have guessed that the man currently struggling to keep his knees from buckling was the same Dante Moretti whose name was usually whispered in the backrooms of the most powerful offices in the state. When they finally crossed the threshold of her apartment, the change in atmosphere was almost violent. Amara's home was a sanctuary of soft textures and low, amber light. The air here didn't smell of rain, gunpowder, or the metallic tang of blood. It smelled of vanilla candles, dried lavender, and the lingering warmth of baked bread. She lowered him onto her small velvet sofa, and the juxtaposition was jarring. Dante's presence was a jagged blade in a room made of soft edges. His tailored trousers, worth more than 3 months of Amara's rent, were smeared with the oily slush of the alleyway. His face, usually sharp and commanding, was a pale mask of exhaustion, the bloody laceration on his temple still weeping onto his collar. He groaned as he slumped back, his head hitting the soft cushions. For a second, his eyes fluttered open, unfocused, dark, and filled with a raw, primal confusion. He looked around the room, his gaze snagging on a framed photograph of Amara's family on the mantel and a half-knitted scarf resting on a side table. It was a world of mundane, gentle things, a world that Dante Moretti had spent 15 years erasing from his own memory. Where? He rasped, his hand instinctively twitching toward his waistband, searching for the weapon that Julian's men had taken before they kicked him into the gutter. "You're safe," Amara said firmly, her voice a calm anchor in the rising sea of his delirium. She didn't flinch as she reached out to peel away the ruined jacket. "You're in my home. And right now, the only thing you need to worry about is staying conscious while I check that wound in your side." She moved with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency, fetching a basin of warm water and a medical kit from the bathroom. As she knelt on the hardwood floor beside him, the warm light from a nearby floor lamp caught the deep, rich tone of her skin and the steady focus in her eyes. Dante watched her through a haze of pain, his breath hitching as she began to cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. In the underworld, Dante was used to being looked at with fear, greed, or calculated loyalty. He had never been looked at with the genuine concern Amara now wore. To Julian and the others, Dante was a throne to be seized. To Amara, he was simply a man who was bleeding on her furniture. As she pressed a warm cloth to the jagged cut on his side, Dante let out a hissed breath, his fingers digging into the velvet upholstery. The displacement was total. The leather and cologne of his penthouse felt like a lifetime away. Here, in the quiet hum of a stranger's apartment, the most feared man in the city was nothing more than a broken variable in a nurse's long night shift. "I don't even know you," he managed to choke out, his eyes locking onto hers. Amara didn't look up from her work. She squeezed the cloth, the water turning a pale pink in the basin. "You don't need to know me to let me save your life, Dante. Now stay still. The rain has stopped, but the night is far from over." The sun had not yet cleared the jagged skyline of the city when Dante Moretti clawed his way back to consciousness. The transition was violent, a sudden jolt of adrenaline that bypassed the lingering haze of the morphine Amara had administered hours ago. For a disorienting second, he wasn't in a quiet apartment. He was back in the alley, the cold rain mixing with the copper tang of his own blood. His eyes snapped open, tracking the unfamiliar ceiling with a predator's instinct. The room was bathed in the soft gray light of a city morning, the air thick with the muffled sounds of the world waking up, the distant hiss of bus brakes, the rhythmic clinking of a radiator, and the low, steady hum of the refrigerator. Dante tried to lunge upward, his hand flying toward the space beneath the pillow where his beretta should have been. A sharp, agonizing flare of white-hot pain exploded in his side, pinning him back against the cushions. He let out a low, guttural hiss, his fingers digging into the soft cotton sheets as he gasped for air. The movement had pulled at the surgical tape across his ribs, reminding him with brutal clarity that the king of the underworld was currently a broken variable in a stranger's living room. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a voice said, calm and unwavering. Dante's head whipped toward the doorway. Amara Vance stood there, framed by the morning light. She wasn't dressed in the heavy wool coat from the night before. Instead, she wore a simple scrub top, her hair tied back in a neat bun. She held a steaming ceramic mug, the scent of chamomile drifting toward him. She didn't look intimidated by the lethal glare he directed at her. To her, he wasn't a threat. He was a patient who was about to tear his stitches. "Where is my gun?" Dante rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. He tried to sit up again, slower this time, his muscles trembling with the effort to reclaim his dignity. "Who are you working for? Julian? Did he send you to finish the job?" Amara walked into the room, her footsteps light and purposeful. She set the mug on the coffee table and crossed her arms, looking down at him with a mixture of professional detachment and genuine concern. "I'm working for a 12-hour shift at the hospital that starts in 2 hours. And I found your gun in the alley. It's currently in a locked safe that you don't have the combination to." Dante's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You're making a mistake. You have no idea who I am or what kind of people are looking for me. If you have any sense, you'll give me my weapon and let me walk out that door." "You can't even sit up without turning gray, Dante," Amara countered, her tone hardening. She stepped closer, reaching out to check the temperature of his forehead. He flinched away from her touch, the paranoid isolation of his life making the gesture feel like an assault. She didn't retreat. She simply waited, her hand hovering in the air until he finally went still, his chest heaving. "Your instinct is to fight," she said softly, her gaze locking onto his. "I get that. In your world, if you aren't fighting, you're losing. But in this room, the rules are different. Here you don't command, you heal. If you walk out that door now, you'll be dead before you hit the sidewalk, and Julian won't even have to waste a bullet." The mention of Julian's name made the air in the room turn cold. Dante looked at the woman standing over him, this stranger who had no stake in his empire, no price tag on her loyalty. He searched her face for the greed he was used to, the flicker of fear that usually followed his name. He found nothing but a stubborn, quiet strength. "Why?" he whispered, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Why stay? Why not just call the police and let them deal with the body in the alley?" Amara picked up the mug and pressed it into his hand. Her skin was warm, a startling contrast to the icy chill still settled in his bones. "Because unlike the men you call friends, I don't need a reason to value a life. Now drink." "That's a command, not a request." Dante looked down at the tea, then back at the door. The breath of the city was outside, loud and dangerous, filled with men who wanted his head. But inside, under the steady gaze of Amara Vance, the king was being forced to learn a new kind of power, the power of letting someone else take the lead. For the first time in 15 years, Dante Moretti didn't fight. He took a sip. While the silence in Amara's apartment was filled with the scent of chamomile and the slow rhythm of healing, the rest of the city was screaming. At the center of the roar sat Julian Varkas. He didn't just take Dante Moretti's throne. He dismantled it to ensure no one else could ever sit there. Inside the high-gloss executive suite of the Moretti penthouse, Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights below looking like a circuit board he finally knew how to program. He was no longer the shadow standing 2 steps behind the king. He was the sun around which the underworld now orbited. He adjusted the sleeves of a charcoal suit that was a shade too sharp, a cut too aggressive, and checked his reflection. The leather and cologne world that Dante had built was now Julian's playground, and he intended to keep it clean. "He's still out there," Julian muttered, his voice cold and devoid of the brotherly warmth he had faked for a decade. He didn't turn around to face the 3 enforcers standing by the mahogany desk, men who had sworn loyalty to Dante only to sell it to Julian for a higher percentage. A man like Dante doesn't just evaporate. If there isn't a body in the morgue, there's a ghost in the streets. The cleaning operation began at midnight. Julian didn't just want Dante dead. He wanted to erase every trace of the old regime. Across the city, the shift was violent and absolute. Enforcers who hesitated to swear the new oath were found in the harbor by sunrise. Warehouses were raided, ledgers were burned, and the paranoid isolation that had once protected Dante was now being used against him. Julian had shut down every safe house and frozen every offshore account. He was suffocating the city, narrowing the world until there was nowhere left for a wounded lion to hide. "Check the hospitals," Julian commanded, finally turning to his men. His eyes were narrow and transactional, devoid of any guilt for the blood on his hands. "Check the clinics. Check every back alley doctor who owes us a favor. If someone is helping him, they are an enemy of the state. I want the man who saved him, the woman who hid him, and the dog that didn't bark. Clear the board." As the enforcers filed out to execute the purge, Julian sat in Dante's leather chair. He picked up a crystal tumbler of scotch, the expensive stuff Dante saved for celebrations, and took a slow, methodical sip. To Julian, this wasn't just a betrayal. It was an evolution. He believed that Dante had grown soft, distracted by a sense of legacy that Julian viewed as a weakness. The citywide manhunt wasn't just about security. It was about the spectacle of dominance. By turning the urban jungle into a cage, Julian was sending a message to the other families. The old rules were dead. The era of the Moretti crown was over, and the reign of Varkas would be built on the absolute erasure of the past. Outside, the rain began to fall again, slicking the streets and washing away the evidence of the night's work. Julian watched the droplets streak against the glass, his silhouette a dark blot against the glowing horizon. He was the shadow that had finally swallowed the light, and as he began the process of cleaning his new kingdom, he felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. He had been the second best for long enough. Now, the only thing left to do was find the ghost and make sure it stayed buried. The fourth day in the apartment felt like a slow-motion collision between two incompatible worlds. Dante was standing by the window, his movements still stiff but no longer the agonizing crawl of a dying man. He watched the city below, his city, where Julian was currently tearing up the floorboards of his life. He felt the phantom weight of the crown he had lost, but more than that, he felt the crushing weight of a debt he didn't know how to settle. Amara was in the kitchen, the rhythmic chop of a knife against a wooden board the only sound in the room. She was preparing a simple soup, her movements devoid of the frantic energy that usually defined the people in Dante's orbit. To Dante, every favor was a transaction, every kindness a loan with a high interest rate. He had spent 15 years navigating a world where free was the most expensive word in the language. He reached into the pocket of his trousers, the only thing Julian hadn't managed to strip from him, and pulled out a heavy, gold-encrusted money clip. It was a relic of his former life, stuffed with high-denomination bills that represented more money than most people in this neighborhood saw in a year. "Amara," he said, his voice regaining some of its gravelly authority. He walked toward the kitchen counter and set the thick stack of cash down next to the onions. The gold clip caught the afternoon light, looking garish and violent against the domestic backdrop. "Take it. For the medicine. For the risk. For the sofa." Amara stopped chopping. She didn't look at the money. She looked at Dante, her eyes calm and unblinking. "Put that away, Dante. It's not enough, I know," he pressed, misinterpreting her pause. He felt a flicker of the old paranoia, the suspicion that she was holding out for a larger payout. "When I get back to my feet, I'll ensure you never have to work another shift in that hospital again. I can buy you the building. I can buy you the whole street. Just take this as a down payment." Amara set the knife down and finally turned to face him. She didn't look greedy. She looked disappointed. "You really don't get it, do you? You think everything has a price tag because that's the only way you know how to control people. If you pay me, then I'm just another person on your payroll. You don't have to feel vulnerable, because you've turned a life-saving act into a business deal." "I don't like being in debt," Dante rasped, his jaw tightening. "In my world, a debt unpaid is a death sentence. I'm trying to protect you." "In my world," Amara countered, stepping closer until the scent of lavender and antiseptic filled his senses, "mercy doesn't come with an invoice. I didn't pull you out of that alley because I wanted a new apartment. I did it because you were a human being who was going to die alone in the rain. If you give me that money, you're taking away the only thing that actually matters here, the fact that I chose to stay." Dante stared at the stack of cash. For the first time in his life, his currency was worthless. He looked at Amara, seeing the genuine concern that had baffled him from the start. He realized that by refusing the money, she was keeping him in a state of terminal vulnerability. He couldn't buy his way out of this connection. He couldn't settle the score. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, the admission sounding like a confession. "I don't know how to be just a human being." "Then start by putting the money back in your pocket," she said softly, picking up the knife again. "And help me peel these carrots. That's the only payment I'm accepting today." Dante stood there for a long moment, the most feared man in the state, silenced by a nurse who didn't want his empire. Slowly, his fingers closed around the gold clip. He slid it back into his pocket, the metal feeling cold and strangely heavy. He picked up a carrot, his hands that had signed death warrants and held the reins of a city, beginning the humble, unfamiliar work of a man who was finally learning that some debts can only be paid with time. The fifth morning arrived not with the jarring sirens of the district, but with a soft, golden light that crawled across the hardwood floors of the apartment. Dante stood on the small balcony, the cool morning air a sharp contrast to the fevered heat that had nearly claimed him. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't looking at the skyline to count the buildings he owned or to spot the rooftops where his snipers might sit. Beside him, Amara leaned against the railing, a ceramic mug cradled in her hands. She wasn't looking at the high-rises either. She was watching a street vendor 2 stories below set up a colorful display of fruit, and a group of school children chasing each other toward the bus stop. "Look at the park over on 4th, she whispered, nodding toward a small patch of green squeezed between 2 gray tenements. "Most people just see a dead end. But every Tuesday, the neighborhood elders meet there to play chess. And in the spring, the cherry blossoms hit that corner first because it catches the most light." Dante followed her gaze. To him, 4th Street had always been a transit route for his shipments, a gray artery in a concrete heart. He had never noticed the chess tables. He had never considered the light. Under Amara's quiet guidance, the city began to reveal a different face, one that didn't revolve around the leather and cologne world of the elite or the calculated chaos of the underworld. "I spent 15 years in this city," Dante said, his voice a low, thoughtful gravel. "I thought I knew every inch of it. Every alley, every payroll, every weakness. But standing here, it's like I've been looking at a map while you've been living in the terrain." "That's because you were looking for things to control, Dante," Amara replied, her gaze remaining on the street below. "When you stop trying to own the city, you start to see the people who actually make it breathe. The woman at the flower stall isn't a variable. She's a grandmother who remembers when this whole block was a garden. The man fixing the streetlight isn't infrastructure. He's a father of 3 who sings in his church choir." Dante felt a strange, uncomfortable shift in his chest. The paranoid isolation that had been his armor for so long felt suddenly heavy, an unnecessary weight in the face of her simple clarity. He looked at her profile, the strength in her jaw, the way she seemed to absorb the sight of the sun without fear. She wasn't powerful in the way he understood power. She had no soldiers, no bank accounts, no weapons. Yet, she stood more securely in this city than he ever had. For a rare, fragile moment, the ghost of Moretti faded. He wasn't the man who had been left to die, and he wasn't the man planning a bloody return to the throne. He was just a man standing in the sun, learning that a city could be a home instead of a battlefield. "It's beautiful," he admitted, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. Amara turned to him then, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "It is. You just have to be willing to look at it without wanting to take it apart." The piece was a lie, of course. Deep down, Dante knew that the shadow of Julian was still lengthening across the pavement. But for this 1 hour, as the sun hit the cherry blossom trees on 4th Street, he allowed himself to breathe the air of a world where mercy was the only currency that mattered. He wasn't just healing his body anymore. He was beginning to see the possibility of a second life, one where the calculated chaos of his past finally went silent. The golden peace of the morning didn't shatter all at once. It eroded through the high-pitched whine of a digital ghost. Dante was sitting at the small wooden table, watching Amara organize her medical bag for her upcoming shift, when the small, encrypted burner phone he had hidden in his jacket lining began to vibrate. It wasn't a call. It was a rhythmic, aggressive pulse of electronic static, a signal flare in a world of silence. Dante's blood went cold, the paranoid isolation of his past flooding back into his veins with the force of a tidal wave. He pulled the device from his pocket, the screen flickering with a distorted series of geometric patterns. In the underworld, this was the sound of a ping, a sophisticated tracing algorithm used by the Moretti family to locate lost assets. Or, in this case, a king who was supposed to be a corpse. "Dante, what is that?" Amara asked, her hand pausing over a box of sterile gauze. She saw the way the color had drained from his face, the way his eyes had hardened into the obsidian flint of the chairman. "Static," Dante whispered, his thumb hovering over the power button. The kind that means the shadow has found a way to bridge the gap. 3 miles away, in the glass and steel cathedral of the Moretti penthouse, Julian Varkas stood over a technician. On the massive wall-mounted monitors, a digital map of the city was a web of blue lines, pulsing with a single, aggressive red dot. It wasn't a precise location yet. The encryption on Dante's burner was a masterpiece of old-school security, but the signal was triangulating. The red dot was hovering over the heights, a neighborhood Julian had previously dismissed as too insignificant for a man of Dante's tastes. "He's there," Julian murmured, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He reached out and touched the screen, his finger resting directly over the block where Amara's apartment stood. "The old man is smarter than I thought. He didn't go to a safe house. He went to ground in the noise of the working class. He's hiding behind a civilian." "Sir, the signal is hopping," the technician reported, his voice tight with the pressure of the moment. "We've narrowed it to a 2-block radius. We need another 30 seconds of active transmission to pin the unit." Dante knew he didn't have 30 seconds. He knew he didn't even have 10. He stood up, the chair scraping against the hardwood with a dissonant screech. He didn't think about his wounds. He thought about the vulnerability of the woman standing across from him. By bringing him here, he had turned her sanctuary into a target. "Amara, listen to me," he said, his voice regaining the resonant, lethal silk of the underworld. "You need to leave. Don't take your car, don't take your bag. Just walk out the back service door and go to the park on 4th. Don't look back. Dante, you're not healed. You can't." "They're coming," he interrupted, the phone in his hand emitting a final sharp screech before he smashed it against the edge of the table. The screen went dark, but the air in the room remained charged with the electronic static of the hunt. Julian found the frequency. "The only thing standing between this apartment and a team of cleaners is the time it takes them to drive across the bridge." He looked at her, and for the first time the genuine concern in her eyes was matched by a flickering spark of fear. He had spent 5 days learning to see the city through her eyes, learning that mercy was a currency. But as the distant thrum of a helicopter began to vibrate through the windowpane, Dante Moretti realized that the time for mercy was over. The calculated chaos of his old life had arrived at her doorstep, and he was the only one who knew how to speak its language. "Go," he commanded, his hand reaching for the locked safe where she had hidden his weapon. "The peace is over, Amara. The storm is here." The vibration of the helicopter rotors was no longer a distant hum. It was a physical pressure against the window panes, a rhythmic thrumming that signaled the end of the lavender-scented peace. Dante stood by the smashed burner phone, his breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts as he waited for Amara to flee. He expected her to scream, to panic, or to crumble under the weight of the calculated chaos he had brought to her doorstep. Instead, Amara Vance went perfectly still. The genuine concern that had defined her face for the last 5 days didn't vanish. It hardened into a cold, tactical clarity. She didn't head for the back service door. Instead, she walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a heavy, olive-drab rucksack that had been tucked behind a stack of winter coats. "I'm not going to the park, Dante," she said, her voice dropping into a low, steady register that stopped his heart cold. "And I'm not leaving you to get slaughtered in my living room." She dropped the bag onto the coffee table and unzipped it. Inside wasn't gauze and chamomile tea. It was a high-grade trauma kit, a portable signal jammer, and a disassembled Glock 17 nestled in a foam insert. Dante stared at the gear, the paranoid isolation of his mind struggling to process the visual. "Amara, what is this?" he rasped, his hand hovering over the back of the sofa for support. "Before I was a nurse at the municipal hospital, I spent 4 years as a combat medic with a forward-deployed unit," she replied, her fingers moving with a practiced rhythmic efficiency as she snapped the slide onto the frame of the pistol. "I've seen cleaning operations that make Julian Varkas look like a child playing with matches. I didn't save your life in that alley just to watch someone take it back tonight." She tossed him a spare magazine. Dante caught it out of the air, the cold metal feeling like a natural extension of his own hand. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that the mercy she had shown him wasn't born of innocence. It was born of experience. She knew the value of a life because she had spent years holding them together under fire. "You lied to me," Dante whispered, though there was no accusation in his tone, only a growing lethal respect. "I gave you the peace you needed to heal," she countered, sliding the signal jammer onto the kitchen counter and flipping the switch. The electronic static in the air seemed to thicken, a localized shield that would scramble Julian's sensors the moment they entered the block. "But that piece is over. We have approximately 4 minutes before the first breach team hits the stairs. We can't stay here, and we can't take the elevators." She moved to the kitchen floor, kneeling to pull back a loose section of the baseboard. She pulled out a small, heavy safe, the one Dante had assumed held his gun. She punched in a code, and the door hissed open. She handed him his Beretta, the weight of it familiar and grounding, but she didn't stop there. She pulled out 2 sets of encrypted earpieces and a localized map of the city's subway tunnels. "The shadow of Julian is looking for a Mafia boss and a helpless nurse," Amara said, her eyes locking onto him with an unfathomable, obsidian intensity. "They aren't looking for a ghost and a soldier. We're going to move through the service tunnels under 4th Street. If we can reach the junction, we can vanish into the noise of the morning commute." Dante felt the displacement of his world once again, but this time it wasn't a fall from grace. It was an ascent into a new kind of alliance. He looked at the woman who had spent 5 days teaching him about cherry blossoms and chess players, now standing before him as a tactical equal. "Julian thinks he's cleaning the board," Dante said, a dark, predatory smile finally touching his lips as he checked the chamber of his weapon. "Then let's show him," Amara replied, pulling her rucksack onto her shoulders, "that some variables are impossible to erase." The transition from sanctuary to battleground was marked by the sudden, sharp percussion of a flashbang detonating in the hallway. The shockwave rattled the dishes in Amara's kitchen, but the explosion didn't find its target. Because of the jammer, Julian's breach team had moved on an outdated heat signature, and by the time the smoke cleared, the apartment was empty. Dante and Amara were already 2 floors down, navigating the service stairs with the synchronized lethal fluidity of a unit that had been together for years. The calculated chaos of the underworld had arrived in full force. The sounds of heavy boots and radio chatter echoed through the stairwell, a predatory search for a man they thought was a crippled variable. "They're cutting off the lobby," Amara whispered, her back against the metal door of the 2nd-floor landing. She adjusted the strap of her rucksack, her eyes scanning the dim space with a tactical intensity that surpassed even Dante's own. 3 men on the main entrance, 2 more by the service elevators. Julian isn't here for a conversation. He's here for a liquidation. Dante checked the sight on his Beretta, the weight of the weapon grounding him as the adrenaline sharpened his senses. "Then we don't go through the lobby. You said there was a junction under 4th. The first engagement happened near the laundry room. 2 of Julian's cleaners, men Dante recognized as former low-level enforcers, rounded the corner with their weapons raised. They expected a nurse and a dying man. They didn't expect the shadow of Moretti to emerge from the darkness like a ghost of vengeance. Dante fired twice, the suppressed thud swallowed by the distant thrum of the helicopter above. The enforcers dropped before they could even register the change in hierarchy. Amara didn't flinch. She moved to the fallen men, her hands stripping them of their radios and extra magazines with a practiced rhythmic efficiency that made Dante's blood run cold with respect. She handed him a tactical headset, her gaze locking onto his. "Switch to channel 4, she commanded. "I've scrambled their encryption. We can hear them, but all they'll get from us is static." As they reached the basement, the building above them seemed to groan under the weight of the siege. Julian's men were tearing through the apartments, their frustration audible through the radio chatter. They were looking for a king, but they were being outmaneuvered by a combat medic and a man who had finally found something worth fighting for besides a throne. The basement was a labyrinth of steam pipes and heavy machinery, the air thick with the smell of industrial grease and old brick. Amara led him toward a heavy iron grate hidden behind a row of boilers. She pulled a crowbar from her bag and pried it open, revealing a dark, sloping tunnel that breathed the damp, metallic air of the city's substructure. "This is it," she said, her voice a low thread against the sound of boots hitting the floor above them. "The junction is 400 yards east. Once we hit the subway lines, we're invisible." A burst of gunfire echoed through the basement as a second team of cleaners found the laundry room. The bullets sparked against the metal pipes, hissing in the dark. Dante turned back, his finger on the trigger, the paranoid isolation of his past demanding he stay and burn the world down to protect his sanctuary. But Amara's hand was on his shoulder, a proprietary strength that pulled him back from the edge of the abyss. "Don't fight their war, Dante," she whispered. "Lead your own." He looked at her, the nurse who was a soldier, the stranger who had become his only truth, and realized the siege wasn't just about Julian's men. It was about the old Dante Moretti trying to hold on to a life of blood. He nodded, holstering his weapon, and followed her into the dark. As the iron grate clanged shut behind them, the shadow of Julian was left to haunt an empty building, while the king and the medic vanished into the heartbeat of the city. The subway tunnels were a labyrinth of wet concrete and screaming iron, the air thick with the smell of electricity and ancient dust. Dante and Amara moved through the service catwalks like twin ghosts, the blue-tinted emergency lights reflecting off the jade pin in her hair and the cold steel of his weapon. Above them, the city was waking up, oblivious to the fact that the ghost of its former king was passing beneath its feet. They emerged through a maintenance hatch in the heart of the business district, just as the first morning sun hit the glass towers of the Moretti Empire. Julian was waiting. He hadn't searched the subways. He had simply waited at the one place he knew Dante's ego wouldn't let him abandon. Julian stood on the steps of the Moretti Plaza, flanked by a small army of mercenaries, his charcoal suit looking sharp and aggressive in the morning light. The standoff was absolute. The calculated chaos of the last 6 days had narrowed down to this single, sun-drenched plaza. "You look tired, Dante," Julian called out, his voice smooth and transactional. He didn't look at the mercenaries. He looked at the woman standing beside his former brother. "I see the nurse has a few tricks of her own. Combat medic. I suppose even a dying lion needs a professional to hold his hand." Dante stepped forward, the weight of the beretta in his hand feeling different than it had a week ago. Behind him, he felt Amara's presence, a steady, proprietary strength that reminded him of lavender, cherry blossoms, and a life he had never thought possible. "The throne is yours, Julian," Dante said, his voice a low, resonant silk that carried across the plaza. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't look for a tactical advantage. He simply stood in the light. The warehouses, the ledgers, the men who sold their souls for a higher percentage. Take them. I've spent 15 years ruling a graveyard. I'm finished being the king of the dead. Julian's smile faltered. The paranoid isolation he expected from Dante was gone, replaced by a terrifying, calm indifference. He had planned for a war, but Dante was offering him a vacuum. "You think you can just walk away?" Julian hissed, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "You're Dante Moretti. You don't retire. You burn." "I was Dante Moretti," Dante countered, his eyes turning to the woman at his side. Amara didn't look afraid. She looked ready. She was the stranger who had become his only truth, the variable that Julian's algorithms could never account for. But the man who bled out in that alley died. The man standing here today doesn't want your crown. He wants his life. Julian let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Then I'll give you exactly what you want. A life that ends in the dirt." But before Julian could move, the electronic static of the city shifted. Amara didn't pull her gun. She pulled the signal jammer from her rucksack and crushed it under her heel. The sudden surge of localized interference didn't scramble Julian's sensors. It signaled the arrival of the authorities she had contacted through a secure, non-Mafia channel an hour ago. The calculated chaos Julian had used to take the throne was now being used to dismantle it. Sirens wailed in the distance, a high-pitched scream of inevitable justice that Julian's mercenaries weren't paid enough to fight. Dante didn't wait for the arrest. He didn't stay to watch Julian's world turn to ash. He reached out and took Amara's hand, his fingers interlocking with hers, a proprietary strength that had nothing to do with fear. "The choice is yours, Julian," Dante whispered as they began to walk away, moving toward the crowd of mourning commuters. "Revenge on a man who doesn't exist anymore, or the redemption of a life you haven't ruined yet." Julian stood frozen on the steps, the king of an empty plaza, as the woman and the ghost disappeared into the heartbeat of the city. Dante Moretti didn't look back. He had spent his life perfecting the art of being a shadow, but as he stepped into the sun with Amara Vance, he realized the sight of the sun was better than any throne. The storm had passed, and for the first time in his life, the king was finally, irrevocably home.